We spent 3 hours driving to the airport, excited for our first family vacation in 5 years, only to be. I've been wrestling with whether to share this story for years now. It's been close to 3 years since everything went down, and I still find myself untangling the mess in my mind. Growing up, I was never the kind of kid my family was proud of. My sister Madison, 4 years older than me, was the shining star, the one who earned straight A's and landed at an Ivy League university without breaking a sweat. Then there was Ethan, my younger brother, who at 22 had already secured a full basketball scholarship thanks to his natural talent and relentless work ethic. And me? I was the middle child who loved wandering with a camera, chasing after moments and scenes my family called a waste of time. My parents constantly told me I was throwing my life away by chasing photography instead of something more practical. College wasn't for me, I figured. So I quit after 2 years and dove headfirst into building a portfolio, renting a cramped apartment in the heart of Minneapolis with a roommate who barely noticed if I was home or not. The first few months were brutal, scraping by on cheap ramen and whatever odd jobs I could find, but I started to get noticed locally. A small art gallery featured some of my photos, and I even got a few paid gigs. None of it mattered to my family, though. To them, I was still the failure who'd ruined everything by not following their plan. So, when I got a text from my mom last summer inviting me on a family vacation to Maui, I was stunned. They hadn't invited me on any trip in over 5 years. The last time I tried, it was a disaster. Dad spent every second criticizing my lack of direction and my pointless passions. Yet here was Mom, sending me detailed plans, flight information, even a list of what to pack, saying it was a fresh start for all of us. I was skeptical, but I wanted to believe maybe this time was different. For 2 weeks, I prepared like it was the chance to finally fit in. I bought new swim trunks, splurged on a decent camera bag I couldn't really afford, and rearranged my schedule, canceling 3 photo shoots with a polite mix of lies and favors. My roommate even gave me a ride to the airport when my car broke down that morning. We met at my parents' house before leaving, and it felt strange but not terrible. Mom seemed genuinely excited, checking that I'd packed everything, while Dad barely acknowledged I was there, which had become his standard. Madison was glued to her phone, and Ethan kept smirking in a way I couldn't read, but I told myself it was just family tension. We drove the 3 hours to the Minneapolis airport in Dad's expensive SUV, and I tried to make small talk. It was met with a wall of silence and sidelong glances, but I convinced myself it was normal. We made it through security without issue and headed to Gate B7. For the first time in a long while, I actually felt hopeful. Maybe this trip was going to be the moment we all started over. Then everything fell apart the second we reached the gate. When the agent began calling for boarding passes, my family all pulled out theirs except me. I reached for mine in my backpack, and that's when Dad started laughing. A cold, cruel laugh I'd never heard before. He looked right at me and said, "Wait, you actually thought we were bringing you?" I thought he was joking, but then everyone joined in, their laughter echoing around the crowded gate area like it was some twisted joke at my expense. Mom wiped tears from her eyes, barely able to speak through laughter as she said, "We only told you about Maui to see if you'd actually show up. Look at this pathetic loser with his little suitcase. Did you tell your imaginary friends you were going on vacation?" Madison, ever the social media queen, had her phone out recording the whole thing for her Instagram, where she had thousands of followers. She narrated the moment like a commentator on some reality show. "Look, he actually showed up." The family disappointment thought he was going to Hawaii. Ethan couldn't stop laughing either, shaking his head and taunting me with, "Bro, you packed your swim trunks and told people at work. You're 29 and still fall for everything. Even kids can see you're a walking loser." Around us, strangers watched. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to notice, but I was frozen, my face burning, unable to grasp what was happening. Then Dad got serious. He locked eyes with me and said, "Look at yourself. 29, stuck in that dump of an apartment. You're not our son. You're our biggest regret." He threw a crumpled $50 bill at my feet and said, "Here's gas money." And some truth. As they walked away toward first-class boarding, something inside me shattered completely. Years of trying to win their approval, all their dismissive words and silent treatments, it all came crashing down. I shouted after them, my voice raw and steady, "You'll regret this. Mark my words. You will all regret this." Dad smirked without turning back and said, "The only thing we regret is that our last name is on your birth certificate." I didn't cry or beg. I just smiled, picked up that pathetic 50, and walked out of the airport with a clarity I'd never known before. I blocked every number, deleted every trace of them from my social media, and vowed never to return to that house. My roommate Dustin was shocked when I told him what happened. He offered to let me stay longer while I figured things out. That night, sitting alone on our tiny balcony, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't over. They thought I was nothing, just some failure they could mock and discard. But I was going to prove them wrong in ways they couldn't even imagine. This was the beginning of something bigger, and I was ready. After walking out of that airport, I felt a strange mix of emptiness and a sudden rush of determination I hadn't known I possessed before. The humiliation was crushing, but beneath it all, something else was starting to grow, an unshakable resolve to change my story completely. I couldn't go back to that family or that life, but I also wasn't ready to give up on myself. That night, Dustin stayed up late, ordering pizza and letting me talk through everything, never pushing me to move on too fast. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was actually listening without judgment. The next morning, I woke up to 3 voicemails from my mom acting like nothing had happened, asking if I could help my dad with some computer issue. I didn't even listen to them all the way through before deleting them and blocking her number. I knew I needed to keep my distance if I wanted to keep this newfound focus. But life wasn't about to make things easy for me. Our lease was ending in 2 weeks. Dustin was moving in with his girlfriend, and I was suddenly facing the real possibility of being homeless. My car was still in the shop, suffering from transmission problems that felt like a perfect metaphor for how stuck I was. Money was tighter than ever, and I was living off ramen noodles and whatever last-minute photo shoots I could scrape together. In a moment of desperation, I posted on a local photography Facebook group, looking for gigs, even the smallest ones. That's when a guy named Lucas reached out, saying he needed someone to take pictures of some properties for his real estate website. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. We met at a downtown coffee shop, and I immediately noticed how intense he was about the angles and lighting. I barely knew anything about real estate, but money was money, and I took the job. After the shoot, Lucas invited me to grab a beer. I wasn't really in the mood to socialize, but I also didn't want to go back to an empty apartment full of silence. Over the beers, he talked about his work developing properties and how his company was struggling with financing and permits. I almost choked when he casually mentioned his boss, who owned the company, but didn't give a name. It took me a moment to realize he was talking about my dad, Greg. I managed to keep my cool, asking questions without letting on I knew the full story. Over the next few weeks, I kept working with Lucas, doing more shoots for his investor friends, and slowly getting my foot in the door of the real estate world. One investor, Claire, took a particular liking to my work and hired me to document a renovation project from start to finish. Even though my housing situation was still a mess, Claire offered me a garage apartment above her detached garage while I worked on the project. It wasn't much, a tiny converted space with a bathroom and a kitchenette, but it was a roof over my head, and that meant everything. Living with Claire introduced me to a whole new world. She hosted dinner parties filled with developers, investors, and real estate professionals. I started getting invited to these gatherings when they needed photography done, and it was at one of those dinners that I heard the full extent of my dad's company's problems. They'd over-leveraged on a big project and were hemorrhaging money fast. Investors were pulling out left and right, and the company's reputation was hanging by a thread. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how my dad spent my entire childhood making me feel worthless, yet here he was, on the brink of losing everything. I started digging, reading every public record, news article, and property listing I could find on Heathcliff Properties. What I discovered was far worse than I expected. 3 failed developments in the past 5 years, and a company barely staying afloat on borrowed goodwill. One day, while photographing a property, I noticed severe water damage that even the owner hadn't spotted. When I pointed it out, he was grateful, thanking me for potentially saving thousands in future repairs. He gave me a bonus and asked if I'd ever thought about getting into property inspection or consulting. I laughed it off, but the idea planted a seed. My attention to detail and photography could actually be an asset in this new world. Around that time, Claire introduced me to Elizabeth, a seasoned property investor known for flipping houses. She hired me to document one of her flips, and during our work, I mentioned a small house in an overlooked neighborhood that I thought had potential. Elizabeth checked it out and ended up buying the place based partly on my recommendation. When she flipped it a few months later, she made a $60,000 profit and handed me a $5,000 finder's fee, the largest amount I'd ever seen in my bank account at once. That's when everything clicked. I realized I didn't have to be just a photographer who dabbled in real estate. I could become a property scout, using my eye for detail to find hidden opportunities. I invested that money in a real estate course and started studying the market seriously. I created a business Instagram where I posted property photos paired with market analysis, slowly attracting more clients and building a network. Last week, Elizabeth invited me to an industry event that I almost skipped because I was worried my dad might show up. But she assured me it was mostly younger professionals, so I went. That's where I met Robert, my dad's business partner, a man desperate for new investors to save their latest sinking project. He had no idea who I was, and I kept it that way. We talked casually, and I pretended to be interested without committing. Robert gave me his card and begged me to call if I knew anyone with capital. I smiled and said I might. But that night, I called Elizabeth with a detailed rundown of the company's weaknesses and assets. She was cautious but intrigued and invited some of her investor friends to consider a possible takeover. Yesterday, I presented to 5 serious investors, explaining why Heathcliff Properties, though failing, was a good buy with the right management. They asked tough questions, but I was prepared, and by the end, they were genuinely interested. Elizabeth said they were forming a group and wanted me to consult. This morning, my phone exploded with calls and texts from my family. My dad furious, my mom panicking, my sister suddenly polite, and my brother just screaming incoherently in a voice message. I haven't replied. Sitting here in this coffee shop, the weight of everything is sinking in. 3 months ago, I was the family joke, humiliated and discarded. Now, I'm part of the group about to buy out the man who made me feel like I was nothing. And this is only the beginning. The weeks following that meeting with Elizabeth and her investors moved slower than I expected. Almost painfully slow, but I learned quickly that business acquisitions never happen overnight, no matter how much fire you have burning inside you. Elizabeth reminded me repeatedly that patience was key and that a strategic approach was essential to avoid blowing the whole thing before it even began. During this time, I stayed locked in my own little world, ignoring every desperate call and message from my family, except for the occasional monthly text from my mom pretending everything was fine and asking how I was doing. I never responded to those messages because I knew better than to fall for her fake concern. Slowly, I began building my reputation within the real estate circle, creating a small consulting business where I helped investors spot promising properties and identify hidden problems. My work wasn't glamorous, just me, my camera, and a sharp eye for details most people overlooked, but it paid enough to move out of Claire's garage apartment and into a small, decent rental of my own. That move felt like a major victory, even though it came with its own worries. The sense of independence fueled me to keep pushing forward. Elizabeth introduced me to Jessica, a no-nonsense lawyer with years of experience in corporate law, who would be instrumental in navigating the legal complexities of the acquisition. I was nervous about telling her the full story behind my involvement, but Elizabeth had already filled her in. When I first met Jessica for coffee, she came prepared with a stack of notes and wasted no time cutting to the chase. She asked if I was absolutely certain about going through with this plan. I told her, without hesitation, that I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Jessica's demeanor was professional, but her words stuck with me long after that meeting. She cautioned me about balancing my emotions with the legal and ethical demands of the situation. She wanted to ensure that my personal feelings wouldn't cloud my judgment or lead me to make decisions that could backfire later. I spent days reflecting on her advice and realized she was right. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about a real business opportunity to turn something broken into something better. My dad's company, Heathcliff Properties, had real value, valuable assets and connections, but it was being dragged down by Greg's ego and reckless choices. Around that time, I started dating someone I met at a coffee shop. She wasn't from the real estate world, and for the first few weeks, I avoided talking about my family. Eventually, though, I opened up and told her everything. The humiliation at the airport, the betrayal, and the takeover plan. She listened quietly, and after I finished, she asked a question that hit me hard. Would ruining your dad's company really make you feel better? Her words stung, and we had our first big fight that night. I told her she couldn't understand what it felt like to be humiliated by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, to be told you were nothing but a mistake. She packed her coat and left, and we didn't speak for a week. When she finally called, she said she couldn't be with someone whose entire life was consumed by revenge. That breakup shook me more than I expected. It forced me to question whether this path I was on was really the one I wanted. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from Madison, my sister, asking if I could photograph her wedding. I nearly dropped my phone. After everything, especially after she live-streamed my humiliation at the airport. I blocked her number immediately. That text reminded me why I was doing this. They never saw me as a person with feelings. I was just a tool to be used or discarded when convenient. I wasn't going to let them forget who I was now. I called Elizabeth and told her I was ready to move forward. The company's situation had worsened, with two major investors pulling out and a key project collapsing. The timing was perfect. We set up a meeting with the investors. 7 people gathered around a conference table, analyzing financial reports and property assessments. I presented a detailed strategy for acquiring Heathcliff properties through calculated, gradual moves. The plan wasn't to buy the company outright at once because that would alert my dad too soon. Instead, we aimed to acquire the company's debt, buy out smaller investors, and surround them until Greg had no choice but to sell. One investor named Ross questioned whether I was too emotionally involved. I admitted that I was, but argued that my personal knowledge of the company gave us an advantage. I knew how my dad thought, what moves he would make when cornered. After some debate, the investors agreed to proceed with the plan. Over the next 6 months, we carefully executed every step. I stayed mostly behind the scenes while Elizabeth and the others made the moves, buying debt and acquiring connected properties. I watched my dad get more desperate by the day. Robert, his business partner, posted panicked messages on LinkedIn seeking new partnerships. It was clear the noose was tightening. Then we hit an unexpected roadblock. My dad convinced a major investor to bail him out. This wasn't part of our plan, and some investors wanted to pull out. I couldn't sleep for days, knowing how close I was to breaking their hold on the company. I spent that weekend digging through everything I could find about this new investor: social media, business records, newspaper articles, trying to find something that could explain why he was helping my dad. That's when I found the story of an old project my dad had worked on with this investor years ago. There were rumors of safety violations and permits being cut corners, but nothing concrete. Taking a risk, I reached out to a city official I'd met through Claire, casually asking about the project. After some hesitation, he hinted at serious violations that had been buried and advised me to check public records at the county clerk's office. I spent days poring over dusty files until I uncovered documents proving that my dad knowingly built on contaminated land and falsified environmental reports. The project had been shut down only because a whistleblower came forward, but Greg had somehow avoided any personal consequences. I shared this information with the investor group, not as blackmail or threats, just as facts. Within a week, the new investor pulled out. Without that bailout, my dad's company was left exposed and on its last legs. That was when we made our move, a formal offer to buy Heathcliff properties. The offer came through a holding company, so my name wouldn't appear anywhere on the paperwork. The terms were fair but firm. They could accept the offer or face bankruptcy. After 2 weeks of tense negotiations, they accepted. I wasn't in the room when my dad signed the papers, but Elizabeth sent me a photo of it. I stared at that picture for hours, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. I had won, but it didn't feel like the victory I thought it would. After the deal was done, I thought maybe I could finally breathe. The nightmare was over. I owned Heathcliff properties now, and it was my turn to fix what my dad had broken. But the truth, as it often is, was more complicated than I expected. Elizabeth handed me a thick folder of company documents to review, and that's when I found it. The folder labeled Family Trust. It was buried beneath financial reports and legal papers, almost like someone wanted it hidden. Inside, I found documents that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. The papers revealed that Greg wasn't my biological father. My real father was his former business partner, the man who had taught me photography when I was a kid, the only person who had ever believed in me. That man had died when I was 14, and for years, my family forbade me from even attending his funeral. Now, I understood why. The trust fund he left for me, a significant sum set to activate when I turned 30, had been managed and mismanaged by Greg to fund his failing projects. Suddenly, all the cruelty, the humiliation, the dismissals made a twisted kind of sense. They wanted me out before I discovered the truth. They hated that I reminded them of my real father. I was still trying to process this bombshell when my phone exploded again with notifications. 70 missed calls, 45 text messages, emails, and Facebook messages flooded my screen, all from my family. They had finally figured out who was behind the acquisition. The last message from Greg was chilling. "We need to talk now." I hadn't replied yet. Instead, I scheduled a board meeting for the next morning, the first real confrontation with the people who had made my life a living hell. I barely slept the night before. My phone buzzed constantly as the texts and calls piled up, threats from Dad, begging from Mom, desperate apologies from Madison, and confused shouts from Ethan. I arrived at the hotel conference room an hour early, wanting to sit at the head of the table, the place I had always imagined but never expected to hold. Elizabeth thought it was petty, but admitted it was brilliant. The room wasn't the main one reserved for the board, but a smaller space in the same hotel chain where I had been humiliated years ago. That detail mattered to me. It was a quiet reminder that I had come full circle. Jessica arrived 40 minutes early, calm and professional with her stack of folders and legal briefs. She was my anchor, the voice that kept me from losing control when emotions threatened to boil over. Elizabeth showed up shortly after, carrying coffee for everyone and sitting firmly across from where my family would enter. The other investors trusted me enough to skip this meeting, leaving the confrontation entirely in my hands. At exactly 10 o'clock, they walked in. Greg first, walking with that fake confidence that always cracked when he was nervous. Mom followed, her face pale and strained. Madison clutched Ethan's arm, both dressed to impress as if this was just another business meeting. The moment their eyes landed on me sitting at the head of the table, everything shifted. Dad froze, his confident facade crumbling. Mom gasped. Madison tightened her grip on Ethan, and for a long, heavy silence, nobody spoke. I broke the silence with a welcome, asking them to sit down. My voice was steady, firm but not cruel. Dad started to protest immediately, talking over me, demanding to know what game I was playing. He said I had no right to steal his company and accused me of knowing nothing about real estate. He called it a pathetic attempt to get revenge. I let him rant for a minute, then raised my hand and calmly told him that Heathcliff Properties was no longer his. The papers were signed, ownership had transferred, and this meeting was about transition plans. The color drained from his face, and he slammed his fist on the table in frustration. Mom tried a different approach, tears streaming as she asked what had happened to her sweet boy. She claimed she had always supported my little hobby and couldn't understand why I would do something so cruel. Madison jumped in, accusing me of being overly dramatic about one bad day at the airport, dismissing the humiliation she had orchestrated as a joke. That's when I reached into the folder Jessica had prepared and slid the trust documents across the table. The shock on their faces was priceless. Dad went pale. Mom stopped crying instantly. Madison and Ethan looked confused at first, then betrayed when the truth sunk in. Dad tried to deny everything, claiming the documents were fake or that I didn't understand what I was looking at. Jessica intervened with clear, legal language, explaining that the trust's existence and validity had been verified, and that using trust money for personal business without the beneficiary's consent was financial fraud. Ethan, who genuinely seemed unaware of most of what had happened, asked what was going on. I told him the truth, that Greg wasn't my biological father, that my real dad had left me a trust fund, and that Greg had been using that money to prop up his failing company without my knowledge. Ethan's expression twisted from confusion to betrayal as he looked from our parents to me. Madison started furiously typing on her phone, probably trying to spin the story or contact allies. Mom just stared at her hands, no longer denying the facts. Dad tried one last desperate plea, saying everything he had done was for the family, that he had invested the trust money to grow it for me, and that I should be grateful he raised me even knowing the truth. I laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh, and told him that if that was true, he wouldn't have spent my whole life making me feel worthless, humiliating me in public, and trying to crush my passion for photography, the one thing that connected me to my real dad. The room fell into a heavy silence. I felt Elizabeth's eyes on me, making sure I kept my composure, and Jessica's quiet presence beside me grounded my rage. Then I laid out the options clearly. Option 1. I would report the financial fraud to the authorities, which would likely lead to criminal charges. Option 2. They could sign a settlement agreement I had prepared, admitting their wrongdoing and walking away with enough money to start over, but not enough to live in luxury. Dad tried to argue, but Mom quietly put her hand on his arm and whispered something. He fell silent for once. Ethan asked what would happen to him and Madison. I told them they weren't responsible for what our parents had done, but since they had participated in humiliating me, I wasn't feeling generous toward them either. Madison finally spoke up, accusing me of wanting to ruin their lives over one bad day. I reminded her of how she live-streamed my humiliation to thousands of people and asked how many bad days she had given me with her constant mockery. She had no answer. Dad asked for time to consider, and I told him he had until the end of the meeting, 20 minutes. He tried negotiating, but I reminded him he had no power here anymore. For the first time, I saw him deflate, looking small and old. Mom asked if there was any chance to salvage the family. I told her honestly I didn't know and that how they handled this would be a start. Ethan surprised me by apologizing. He said he had been a jerk because that's what he thought brothers were supposed to be, and that Dad made it seem like I deserved it. He asked if we could talk privately someday. I said maybe, but not right away. Madison didn't apologize. She just kept scrolling on her phone, shooting me resentful looks. When the 20 minutes were up, Dad and Mom signed the settlement without reading it carefully, which was typical. Before leaving, Dad asked what I planned to do with the company. I told him I was going to rebuild it, fix the problems he created, and run it ethically. His dismissive sneer was all I needed to hear. He said I wouldn't last 6 months. I smiled and told him I'd already lasted 3 years without him or his money. They left the room, but Mom lingered at the door. She asked if she could call sometime. I neither said yes nor no. She nodded and left. After they were gone, I leaned back and finally exhaled. Elizabeth high-fived me, and Jessica started organizing the papers. That day marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For a while after the meeting, I thought maybe I could finally close the door on everything my family had done to me. But life has a way of pulling you back in when you least expect it. Just as I started to rebuild Heathcliff Properties with a renewed focus on integrity and long-term growth, my phone buzzed with a message that made my blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short but chilling. You don't know the whole story. There's someone else. At first, I thought it was a prank or some kind of twisted joke, but the way the message was worded felt far too personal and deliberate to ignore. I spent the next few days trying to trace the sender, but they covered their tracks well. Eventually, more messages followed, each one dropping cryptic hints about a secret family member, a half-sibling no one had ever told me about. According to these messages, this person had been kept hidden by Greg and Linda, buried deep beneath the family's carefully constructed lies. The thought shook me to my core. After everything I'd uncovered and the battles I'd fought, there was still more I didn't know. The story I thought was complete was only half told. I couldn't sleep. Every quiet moment was filled with questions that gnawed at my mind like a relentless tide. Who was this person? How had they stayed hidden all these years? And most importantly, what did they want? Was this someone who would understand my pain? Or were they another weapon in the family's arsenal, sent to break me down further? I knew one thing for sure. Ignoring this wasn't an option anymore. If I wanted to finally have control over my life and my past, I needed to face whatever was coming next head-on. The message said they wanted to meet and gave me a location, a small cafe on the outskirts of Minneapolis. I debated for days, the fear of what I might discover warring with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this person could be an ally, someone who could fill the void I'd carried for so long. Eventually, I told Elizabeth and Jessica about it. They advised caution but supported me when I decided to go. For once, I felt like I wasn't alone in this battle. The day of the meeting, I arrived early and sat with my hands wrapped around a cold coffee, trying to steady the chaos swirling inside me. When the door opened and the person stepped in, I was surprised, not by their face, but by the way I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like an old wound suddenly opened to let light in. They were younger than me, with eyes that held stories of their own and a quiet strength I hadn't expected. They didn't waste time. The first words out of their mouth were, "You're not the only one who's been lied to." They told me about years spent in the shadows, watching the family drama unfold from a distance, kept apart by Greg and Linda's secrets and lies. They had their own story of exclusion and loss, and their arrival wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of a reckoning long overdue. Our conversation lasted hours, peeling back layers of family history I had never known existed. I learned about betrayals that ran deeper than my own, about sacrifices made and promises broken in the name of maintaining appearances. It was painful and raw, but also strangely healing. For the first time, I felt like I was meeting someone who truly understood the scars I carried, someone who could stand beside me instead of against me. But just as hope began to take root, they dropped a bombshell that sent my world spinning again. There was more than one family secret. They hinted at financial dealings, hidden properties, and manipulations that even Greg didn't know about. Secrets that had been carefully buried but were now threatening to explode. It was clear this wasn't just about personal family drama anymore. It was about power, control, and a battle that extended far beyond what I'd imagined. The meeting ended with a promise to uncover the truth together. We agreed to keep our alliance secret for now, to watch and wait. and to prepare for whatever storm was coming next. As I walked away from that cafe, a new sense of purpose filled me. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I'm sharing this now because so many of you have asked for updates, and because I know this story isn't over. The family, I thought I'd finally broken free from still holds secrets that could change everything. But I'm ready for whatever comes next. This is just the beginning of a new chapter, and I'm determined to write it on my own terms, no matter how dark the road ahead might be.